All right, we're going to pick up where we left off and finish our lecture on Manifest Destiny. And last time we talked, we were talking about President James K. Polk. Now, Polk was a pretty serious guy, the kind of guy that wanted to handle things himself. He was not very good at delegating jobs. And as a result, he worked himself literally to ill health, but he kept it simple. In James K. Polk's program, there were 4 things that he wanted to accomplish, and amazingly, he was able to accomplish them in his first term, and we'll go through these. Lowering the tariff, restoring the independent treasury, and we'll talk about what that means. Settling, finally, the Oregon issue between Britain, and where would we draw that line, and then finally, the acquisition of California. His strategy on the territories in Oregon, it was to talk very brave and threaten war, but be willing to settle the issue without having to go to war. After all, Britain was still a great world power, and it would have been a very difficult war. We'd survive too with Britain, but it would be very difficult to do that a third time. Regarding California, which at the time was property of Mexico, the idea was let's work towards settlement, but we'd much rather fight Mexico than Britain, so be prepared for war if that's what it comes to. So first, on lowering the tariff. Polk's Secretary of the Treasury was Robert Walker. Walker was able to convince Congress to lower the tariff from 32% to 25%. Doesn't sound like a big difference, but to those people at the time, it was pretty significant. Now, clearly, to those New Englanders who always supported the high tariffs, this would have been something they didn't want necessarily in the middle states as well. On the flip side, obviously the South would be very much supportive of this. So this is something that endeared Polk and his administration to those in the South, because after all, Polk was from the South. So in 1846, Congress passes the Walker Tariff. Now the Walker Tariff, even though it lowers the tariff to 25%, it generates a lot of money because we're coming out of the Panic of 1837. We're having a boom time, so there's a lot of money generated, and there's also some heavy imports, things that aren't made in this country that people want to buy. So the tariff, although it's lowered, makes a lot of money. The next prong in Polk's program is restoring the independent treasury. Now, if you remember back, Van Buren had proposed it. It had been adopted, but under Tyler and the Whigs in 1841, it was dropped. And again, the independent treasury, it's not quite the national bank, but it is sort of taking federal money out of the state banks, because the state banks, remember, were largely to blame for the Panic of 1837 after Andrew Jackson basically killed the national bank. Pro-business portion of the Whigs were those folks behind passing the restoration of the independent treasury in 1846. So prong 2 is taken care of. Regarding the Oregon problem with Britain, or issue with Britain. Now the South and the North have both agreed that it made sense to annex both Texas and Oregon. Now remember the idea of Manifest Destiny. Texas had been annexed in 1845. Remember that joint resolution after Polk was elected, but before Polk came into office. And Texas was now a state with the proviso, if you remember from your reading, that it could ultimately down the road be divided into multiple states. This idea of sectionalism in the South made them not necessarily keen. They certainly wouldn't have disapproved of it, but adding territory in the North is not going to be quite as important to those in the South. So those expansionists in the South weren't necessarily pushing for annexation of Oregon. Now those in the North definitely wanted to expand and control the Oregon Territory, and they wanted to extend it all the way up to the line of 5440. If you remember, right by past where the line is today, into what is modern-day Canada. 1845, Polk goes to Britain and requests that we draw the line at 49 degrees, but at this point, 1845, Britain rejects Polk's effort to settle for that line. By 1846, Britain kind of comes to their senses and they change their mind and they come back and they propose themselves drawing the border at the 49th parallel. They decided that at this point in the bigger picture, it didn't make sense for them to go to war with the United States. They were also looking at reality, and they realized, if you remember, that the Americans had many, many more settlers in that Columbia River area, and that if push came to shove, the U.S. would probably have the resources available in the territory to seize that area anyway. So they were willing to settle. 1846, the Senate approves the treaty with Britain, setting the line at the 49th parallel. Anti-slavery Northerners didn't like the compromise at all. They're looking at Texas, and they say, why did we get all of Texas, but only get part of Oregon? They accused Polk, a Southern president, of settling. But if you look at it through the lens of history, the U.S. was probably much better off settling at the 49th parallel, splitting the difference, than possibly going to a third war with Great Britain. Very pragmatic decision on Polk's part. Shift our gears here and look to California. Expansionists, both North and South, wanted to add California as a state. San Francisco Bay, the biggest bay at this point on the western coast, very conducive to trade. The valleys, San Fernando Valley and other areas of California, very fertile land for agriculture, and still very important to agriculture in our country today. Now, the population in 1845 was pretty mixed in California. Not too many people out there, 13,000 Mexicans, 75,000 Indians, some of those left over from when it was controlled by Spain and converted, and not many Americans, just about 1,000. Misunderstandings with Mexico. Now, initially, Polk wanted to avoid war, and remember, he wanted to try to get a settlement with Mexico, so he wanted to buy California, but he was not able to because of, as you can imagine, the poor relations the U.S. has with Mexico, primarily because of the borders around Texas. Now, Mexico had also defaulted on $3 million that Mexico had owed to United States citizens, and diplomatic relations were cut off by Mexico after the United States annexed Texas in 1845. And there's this ongoing dispute about what the boundary of Texas is. Is it, as Mexico believes, the Nueces River, a little bit further north, or is the border actually the Rio Grande, which is the more modern day border today? So there's some disputed land between these two rivers that is claimed by both Mexico and by the United States. So Polk kept troops out of this disputed area that both countries claimed at this point in order to avoid provoking a war. Here's a map so you can see the difference in the boundaries. Here is the Rio Grande River coming through this way, and you can see the Nueces River over here. So this disputed territory in here is claimed by Texas and also claimed by the United States. In 1945, there were rumors going around Washington that Britain was going to step in and take California. Remember, Britain was still going to be a real concern for the United States at this point because they were a world power. If Britain did make an effort to take California, this would be, as we've talked about, a violation of the Monroe Doctrine that would require, if the United States is going to support this doctrine, that they declare war on Britain. So late in 1845, President Polk sends John Slidell to negotiate with Mexico to see if we can resolve the situation. Now, Slidell was authorized to spend up to $25 million to buy California, so buy it peacefully without any military conflict. But Mexico refuses to see him. They won't even accept a meeting with Slidell at this point. So in essence, the door is slammed in Polk's face at this point. So again, this is 1845. And this is where things get a bit dicey. In January of 1846, Polk, in essence, does what he can to provoke a war. First thing he does is he sends General Zachary Taylor down to Texas with 4,000 troops, arguably to protect this southern border of Texas. And at this point, we don't necessarily have any confrontations that happen. But by May of this year, Polk, anticipating that there's going to be a conflict, proposes a direct declaration of war to his cabinet, that we kind of proactively declare war on Texas based on a couple things. The default on the money that was owed United States citizens in Texas, and the rejection of Slidell from even being able to meet with Mexican officials. The cabinet, I would say very realistically at this point, looks at these reasons and doesn't really believe that Polk should take this to Congress and ask for a declaration of war. These reasons aren't quite strong enough. And we need for Mexico to do something. It would be preferable if Mexico was the one that started this war. So stay tuned and see what happens. So lo and behold, later that night, May 9th, news arrives in Washington that Mexican troops had fired upon Zachary's troops in the area. Turns out that on April 25th, just the month earlier, and remember it takes a while for news to travel, especially when you're out there in the wilderness, Mexican troops apparently had crossed the Rio Grande River. Remember, that's the border that the United States claimed was the border of Texas, but Mexico claimed that it was further in the Nueces River. So Mexican troops had crossed the Rio Grande and fired onto Taylor's troops, killing 16 and wounding others. Polk, remember, who already had a declaration of war ready, sends the message to Congress. He claims that Mexico had forced the war because Mexico had shed, and this is important in quotes, American blood upon the American soil. Congress overwhelmingly approves and votes a declaration for war. Even the North, the anti-slavery North, supported the war, although some later turned against Polk because of it, and there certainly were some resistors to the efforts in the Mexican-American War, a significant one being Henry David Thoreau. So let's take a look at Polk's claims that Mexico fired on U.S. troops on U.S. soil. So if you remember, to Mexico, the soil that they were on, even when they crossed the Rio Grande River, was Mexican soil. So it wasn't American soil, at least in the eyes of Mexicans. Matter of fact, Abraham Lincoln specifically introduced a resolution, spot resolutions in Congress, asking Polk to specify exactly where on the map these hostilities occurred, because he had his doubts about whether this action might have been justified. Anti-slavery Whigs in the North didn't believe Polk, and they felt that he, partially to their credit, that Polk had provoked this war, and this is what he had intended to happen all along. So who caused the war? Well, certainly Polk wanted the war because he wanted to take California. Mexico refused to sell it and to give it to us without military action. Polk also feared that the British might take it, or they might act to influence the area if the United States didn't act. Mexico believed that they could defeat the United States. They had a pretty big army, and they even dreamed that eventually, certainly overestimating in retrospect, but dreaming that they could invade the United States and take back not only Texas, but possibly some additional land as well. Mexico also hoped that the United States might get drawn into a war with Britain over Oregon. So it would be a simultaneous war, making it difficult for the United States to face two foes on the north and the southern front. And Mexico, frankly, didn't believe or miscalculated, thinking that the U.S. would not be able to successfully invade Mexico. And in the end, both Americans and Mexicans believed that it was the other side that provoked the war. I refer you now to reading 81 in our primary documents, Henry David Thoreau's resistance to civil government. One of those famous protesters didn't want his taxes to go to support the Mexican-American War. And remember, Henry David Thoreau is an inspiration to Gandhi and Martin Luther King and other peaceful civil resistance type folks. Let's talk a little bit about Santa Anna, leader of the Mexicans. Remember back when Santa Anna had taken over in Mexico and led the charge on the Alamo and was ultimately captured by Sam Houston, forced to sign a treaty giving away the land that becomes Texas. Well, in the interim, he had been exiled in Cuba. The United States had allowed him to return with the hope that he would assist the United States against the Mexican government. Well, Santa Anna, being a wily guy, he betrays the United States, and he ends up again leading the Mexican army against the United States in the Mexican-American War. August 1846, so remember we're just a few months into the confrontation here. General Stephen Kearny takes Fort Santa Fe. Remember Santa Fe in modern-day New Mexico. Then he charges off to the west to California. June 1846, Captain John Fremont, remember that name, works with Americans in California and the U.S. Navy to overthrow those Mexicans that were still controlling California. And they establish, for a short time at least, the independent Bear Flag Republic. So the Bear Flag Republic before California goes through the process of becoming a state. So there is what is still part of the state flag of California, the flag of the California Republic. (1846 and 7), General Zachary Taylor, remember he was already in Texas and Mexico down there by the border. He invades Mexico. By February the next year, with just 5,000 troops, he's able to push back Santa Anna, who has a significantly higher number of troops. Also early in that year of 1847, General Winfield Scott lands at Veracruz and moves north all the way to Mexico City, so to the heart of the Mexican government. September of 1847, so it's not a very long war, just over a year and a few months. America declares victory at Mexico City under Winfield Scott. The treaty that finally ends the war in February of 1848, one of my favorite to pronounce, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, is signed between Trist, who's the envoy of the Americans, and the Mexicans. And under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the U.S. gets official title to Texas, even though we didn't necessarily feel that we needed it. We also get a lot of land. It was about half of Mexico at the time. It's called the Mexican Cession. Presently, the U.S. Southwest, including California, is granted to the United States. The United States also agrees to pay $15 million for this land. So pause for a second and think about, why would the United States, that has just defeated Mexico, pay $15 million for the land? Well, there's a couple answers for that. First of all, Polk, remember, was willing to offer $25 million for just California. Mexico also owed U.S. citizens in Texas money, and this was, after all, half of Mexico at the time. So part of it is sort of an effort of goodwill, the United States being a much more wealthy country than Mexico was even at this time, so not taking away everything that Mexico has, but also think about it possibly to pave a more positive path to a relationship down the road, because after all, we are going to remain, we are going to continue to share a border. So think about how that might impact. We'll have things that happen in much later units, which, if you can remember, we'll talk about as we are in World War I, something called the Zimmerman Telegraph, and other issues that might come to rise. So that's one of the reasons, and several reasons, why the United States agrees to pay $15 million for the land. And again, they also agree to assume those debts that Mexico owed to United States citizens. So Polk submits the treaty to the Senate for approval. There are some, the conscience Whigs in the Senate, who oppose the war and expansion, especially of southern land, because they believe slavery is going to at least attempt to extend out there. They threatened to cut off funding for the war as early as 1847. The expansionists were a little disappointed because they wanted to take not just half of Mexico, they wanted to take all of Mexico. So you couldn't please everyone with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But Congress does compromise, again, one of those words that doesn't get used very often, and they approved the treaty by a vote of 38 to 14. So here you can see the land with the modern day boundaries of the Mexican cession, an awful lot of land. So parts of New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, Nevada, and all of California. You'll notice this little part down here, which is not yet part of the United States, but stay tuned and we'll see how the United States gets that here in just a bit. Okay, another view of the territory that is added, and you can see how Texas had claimed even parts of what had or what are now New Mexico and Colorado. We'll see how those get split off a little bit later, and here's the first mention of this little sliver here at the bottom, that being the Gadsden Purchase. So in the bigger picture, no war is without its costs, but the Mexican War was a relatively small war. Only 13,000 U.S. soldiers died, and most of them didn't die from fighting, they died from disease. Again, the United States increased its land by about a third. Remember, this Mexican cession is a huge tract of land. Interestingly, it gave some battlefield experience to some generals that will turn out to be very important, probably the most important of whom are Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, who we'll see be leaders in the Civil War for the North and the South, but also General Tecumseh Sherman, who will also be a key general for the North. The U.S. military did very well. No defeats in the battle with the Mexican army. Very few mistakes were made. And in the eyes of the rest of the world, especially Britain, the U.S. was seen as a much more formidable opponent. So our reputation is beginning to grow as having a powerful army, military. The Mexican army, to their credit, they were good fighters. They fought with passion, with a fierce intensity, but in the end their leadership was not very strong. The U.S. certainly developed a respect for the ability of the Mexican army to fight. And the Mexican-American War is a turning point in relations between the U.S. and Mexico, and frankly, for that matter, the rest of Latin America. And increasingly, we'll talk about the United States' relationship with Latin America. Mexico is left with a bitter taste in its mouth, feeling that the United States stole their land, provoked the war, and ended up taking half of their country. Before this, to some extent, they had seen the United States as something of a friend. Now they're seen as a very powerful and greedy bully, which we'll see how that plays out as we go forward. Perhaps most importantly, the Mexican-American War again brings the slavery issue to the forefront. The North claims, and most opposition there was to the war came from the North, believed that the war was fought just to extend land opportunity for the slave trade. Most of the land gained was south of that line, 3630, remember the Missouri Compromise. Most of the soldiers that fought in the war were from the South, although realistically that happened because they were closer to the action and they were easier to get to the front lines. We have a significant piece of legislation that's introduced into Congress, a representative from Pennsylvania in 1846, so this would have been while the war is still going on. The The Wilmot Proviso from David Wilmot. It proposed that slavery would be banned in any territory that would be taken from New Mexico. Now, as you can imagine, in the House of Representatives, where because it's based on representation and population, the North had the majority, this proviso, which would have favored anti-slavery North, passed. But in the Senate, where at this point we have equal numbers of slave and free states, it did not pass. All but one free state legislature endorsed it as well. But the slavery issues that are brought on by this expansion of territory in the Mexican-American War and the Mexican Cession are not settled until after the outcome of the Civil War. So what's the significance of the Wilmot Proviso? Well, one thing the Wilmot Proviso starts to do is to split what had been national parties into sectional parties. So bear with me on this. Northern Whigs and Democrats in the North voted for the Wilmot Proviso. Southern Whigs and Southern Democrats voted against the Wilmot Proviso. So what then becomes of these national parties? Can the Democrats remain united North and South? Can the Whigs remain united North and South? We'll see this begin to change. So looking back at Polk and his accomplishments, well, in the end he did settle the Oregon question with Britain without firing a shot, compromised on the 49th parallel. In the end he was able to acquire California. He reduced the tariff to a much more reasonable number of 25%, and in the end was able to increase revenues because the economy was getting stronger. He does establish an independent treasury. So if you look at it by these objectives, certainly laid out by him in his one and only term, he's probably a very successful president, at least by that account. Certainly history takes in many more factors into account, and we will leave it up to you as to whether you think Polk is the most successful president in the United States. So what about Polk and his relation to the powers of the presidency? Well, Polk, in his actions during his term, discovered that there are some latent constitutional powers that the president commands. The commander-in-chief has the power, as Polk certainly did in this point, in this instance, to provoke a war. He put the pieces in place where he wanted what he wanted to happen happened, was able to quickly get congressional approval, shape the strategy for fighting the war, appoint the generals to fight the war, and in the end also define the terms of the peace. He did as much to expand presidential power as anyone, even up into and including Andrew Jackson. Also expanded the domain of the United States geographically more than any other president, including Thomas Jefferson. So how do you judge James Polk and his success as president? And with this, we'll wrap up our discussion of Manifest Destiny. We will move on from here.